Well, hello and welcome. My name is Patty Lindgren, and this is the first broadcast from the Emerging Community Healing Initiative in Saskatoon. We call it CHI for short. We say that we are a conversation for waking up to what is going on in the world and responding as if the fate of all beings and creation itself is in the care of village. Village and soul, nature and spirit. These are our drivers, that and opening a space where people can come together to connect again and to talk about things that matter. Next month on November 13th, CHI presents Die Wise, a manifesto for sanity and soul, which is a day-long talk with Stephen Jenkinson in the flavor of his most recent book by the same name. Stephen is a farmer and a spiritual activist, a social worker, an author. He's a teacher and a founder of the Orphan Wisdom School in the Ottawa Valley. He has a master's in theology from Harvard and a master's in social work from the University of Toronto. He's the subject of a film called Grief Walker and the author of 3 books, Money and the Soul's Desires, How It All Could Be, and Die Wise, a manifesto for sanity and soul. We're excited to welcome Stephen to Saskatoon for part of our fall programming, which is in honor of eldership and the end of life. And the other day I had a chance to speak with him and have some conversation with him around some of the important topics of the day and around his work, that of a death-phobic culture. We talked a little bit, I got a little bit vulnerable, put myself up, and we talked a little bit about my own personal experiences with dying, just a smidge. We rolled into what being scared to die has to do maybe with how we might be handling what appears to be the death of our own culture at this moment, and how that might be having us resisting the hard questions. We also talked a little bit about what he means by orphan wisdom and how orphan wisdom might be a good kind of help for people in Canada right now, where we have the Truth and Reconciliation process trying to get its legs and to do our healing over the history of our country and how it was settled. So the interview went well in spite of my nervousness, and it was a real leaning in for me to push myself to new boundaries, to live my purpose better and do better with some of the ideas and the concepts and the realities of what growing older means and what it means to really show up. So without further ado, let's get started with welcoming Stephen. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So these days we are living in a culture of death phobia, afraid of dying and not really participating in our own dying and the dying of our loved ones very actively.
I've heard
And
that.
so, yeah, well, and so we'd like to hear a little bit from you about that situation and what you think might be behind it, how it's affecting us, and what we can do about it.
Well, a good caveat always to begin with, which is an authentic one too. It's not just a damage control, is to say, I haven't been everywhere, and I haven't lived everywhere, and I haven't lived with everybody. Nor has my work brought me to literally the 4 corners of the earth. I've been to a lot of English-speaking countries over the years, but it's really proper not to generalize, I think. And sometimes you have to make broad statements to say anything at all. So you're not talking about the same 7 people that, live close to you, for example. But I think the kind of burdensome privilege that I was granted in working in the death trade for so many years, what it does is it lends me a kind of window on, quite a few people in a challenging, treacherous, sometimes dangerous, and ultimately futile time in their lives. Futile meaning that they would have had it otherwise, but they didn't get their wish, kind of thing. So everything you're going to hear from me should be understood to come from, that very specific kind of work. And from that, I could say something to you about this death phobia you mentioned. I'm not the first person, certainly didn't invent the term. I found when I was working in the trade for as many years as I did, I was one of the very few people who was willing to proceed as if it was true, which is partly means it's obligatory to craft a language, I think, where the realities of what you're actually talking about appear, that you're not conceptualizing, you're not opinion mongering, that much more importantly, you're bearing a faithful witness to what you saw. You can't do that with a language that doesn't carry the realities in it, not things you describe, but actually in the very vocabulary that you employ and you resort to. And I must tell you, I worked deeply and ongoingly at that, only because I began to discover very early that the language that was the ultimate court of last resort, not just for the people dying, not just for their families, but frankly for the people who were paid, and in some cases paid very well, to know better and to do better than to collude with a kind of emaciated, death-free language that amounted to kind of lunatic cheerleading proposition masquerading as being supportive. So there's the first iteration of what I could mean by death phobia is that it doesn't recognize itself when it's active. You could say it this way: not everyone was terrified of dying if you were to have asked them. A lot of people wouldn't have admitted that they were dying when they were, never mind that they were afraid to die while they were dying. Those people were in the minority, frankly. So you had a majority of people, and I'm talking about my own professional experience, hundreds of people now, who came into their dying time openly at war with the time in their life that they found themselves to be. And I'd like to draw you a parallel to give you a feel for whether that really constitutes sanity or, life affirmingness or what. Let's imagine, you may not have to imagine it, you may be able to remember it, but let's imagine that you're pregnant. And let's imagine you're not wondering if you're pregnant. You're not concerned that you might be pregnant. You're not awaiting the test results to confirm it or otherwise. You straight up know that you're pregnant, and you're not in the early going. So let's imagine you're in the 3rd trimester. And at this point in the proceedings, the people around you are still willing to collude with you that if you don't feel like you're pregnant today, if you don't want to be pregnant, if you don't believe in being pregnant, then you don't have to be. And you can proceed through your days as if you are pregnancy free, as if it's a matter of opinion, as if you have no obligation to the pregnancy, nor to being pregnant, nor to this young one who has come to you. No obligation whatsoever. At best, it's an annoyance, and the measures that you take regarding the annoyance are there to serve you, not what you're entrusted with. You follow what I'm saying? Item by item here, the realities of dying and the realities of pregnancy, as I just described them. I mean, it's a lunatic proposition I've just given you, but you can recognize item by item the parallelism between the two. And I saw it virtually every day. So there's a second iteration of death phobia that we actually imagine that the principal realities of life somehow correspond with our preferences, somehow obey our insistence that this is our life and that it should unfold as we see fit. And that if life is fair and just and merciful, then my own will is recognizable in how my life unfolds. There's another iteration of death phobia. So I could go on with the examples, but I think you're getting the feel of what I mean by the phrase. It's not an overt kind of nails on the wall terror that begets all manner of antidepressants and sedation at the end of life, though God knows that happens in enormous quantities. But you wouldn't recognize the death phobia if what you were looking for was somebody screaming like a bad scene from The Exorcist. You see, it's a much subtler proposition than that, as I saw it, and the principal strangeness of it all is that most of the attributes of the terror would not be recognized as any kind of fear at all. They'd be recognized as an extension of your belief system or your system of preferences that you've generated for your life, that kind of thing.
You know, I have some very up close and personal experience with death, having been there at the deathbed of my grandmother and then my father and then my mom. And I should say my dad and my mom, because he was definitely a great dad. And though death had been very much a part of our lives, and I think we faced it probably as good as anyone, there was lots of conversations we didn't have. And I remember in particular with my dad being really scared to talk about it, to talk about his dying with him. Mm-hmm. And often we would just sit there in silence, neither one of us speaking. And there wasn't any help for us. We didn't have a character like you around to help us with it.
Uh-huh. I don't either, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what do you make of that silence looking back on it now?
Well, you know, my dad was a very humble and wise man. I have this sense that his heart was a little broken for not being able to find the words, and maybe for us not having words. He was very adamant not to go under the life-saving measures. He accepted that his time was coming, and he didn't want to do anything to interfere with that. And that in itself could have been an opener for us, because even though I think we all supported his choice, Mom and my brother and I all supported his choice, I don't know, there's a lot of meaning in there in a conversation that never took place. And I think maybe Dad was sitting there quietly in his armchair reflecting on all that stuff at the time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, obviously I wasn't there, and probably you're on the mark for it all. But I was there for a lot of times in a lot of families where what you described was the norm. And what I saw it characterized most of the time was that silence wasn't some kind of achieved equanimity or peace of mind. Generally speaking, that silence was an absence. And it's closer to how you began to describe it, something in the order of not having the words, as you say.
Yeah.
And this leads us back to a serious contention of mine, which goes something like this. You would think that there are a few times at least in life that are made to order to bring out either the best in us or the deepest running part of us or the most deeply devotional part of us, something like this. And you might imagine births might be in that order, perhaps weddings might be in that order. But holy cow, shouldn't dying be maybe even at the top of the list if you've ever waited for a reason to be open or to be frank or to be out there or to be candid or to, you know, fill in whatever you're waiting for? You'd think that time must be clearly dragging you to the very brink of what you haven't been able to manage until now. And I can tell you this, it's not millions of people I was with, and it's not thousands, but all of the people I saw, with very few exceptions, died pretty much exactly in the manner that they lived. You didn't see any conversions to a kind of wisdom that their life did not prepare them for. And you certainly never heard a kind of language of candor or frankness or a resolve or anything of the kind suddenly appear on their lips that hadn't been there at any other time. And I hope that that's a bracing thing for people to hear, because I mean it to be. It's, if you wait, I mean, I'm going to say a grown-up thing now. If you wait until you're dying to get it straight, or to get a relationship straight, or to get your business in order, whatever it is, there is such a thing as too late. If you come to your dying time as a frank amateur in these matters, there is no reason to suspect that with your waning energy and all the symptoms that you're nursing along at the same time, that you would find something in you that has escaped you until now. There's simply no reason to expect that. And I virtually never saw it happen. So the sad tragedy of that for me, over and above, some of the other more obvious things, is you would probably wish that people were dying in the manner of their living only if they had lived their life in a culture that frankly educated them in a deep and enduring way about what dying asks of them and how they might come to it. But if those same people have not lived in a culture like that, but instead lived in a culture that's like the one we've been referring to, that has enormous amounts of phobia and aversion and, absolutely chained to the whipping post of preference and personal style and self-determination and all of those things, if that's the culture you grew up in, you do frankly come to your dying as an amateur of the wretched kind. And sadly, it's that wretchedness and that amateurishness that really was my job security when I was there. That's what created the job. It wasn't the dying that created the job that I had. It was the inability and the refusal to die that created the job. That was my real employer.
Yeah, I'm imagining if the dying one can give way to grief and vulnerability, that there's new life. Like who knows where we go when we cross over, and I believe there's life over there as well. But there can be new life here for those of us who are left. A new way to go at things with more gusto, more roots. Some celebration and gratitude, I guess, and like you say, that recognition that it can be too late for honest redemptions.
It often is too late. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hope as you will, but hope doesn't have an enormous part to play in the story that you and I are talking about now. And I think, allow me to make an observation about what you just said. If this is an extension of what I said a minute ago, if it were inevitable that being troubled by a particular death that you were lucky enough to be let in on, if it were inevitable that you would take the lessons from that and immediately and obviously and resolutely and permanently live a more deepened life, then it would stand to reason that given all the bad deaths that I saw, the consequence of all those bad deaths should be this enormous education that's unfolding in the dominant culture around this thing. You see, because so many people are exposed to bad dying, the redemption should more or less follow. You know what I'm going to say next. If that were true, then please explain to me why we have so much bad dying going on. And the answer is, bad dying does not beget wisdom. It does not beget redemption necessarily. It doesn't beget insight of any kind. If anything, what we're contending with here is a kind of compound fracture through the generations, where people exposed to the wretched kind of pharmaceutically driven, medically, technologically driven kind of submission that passes for good dying today. Who knows how many generations back that began, but you're easily we're in the fourth generation of hospital-dominated dying now. And for all of that, in my humble estimation, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. It is getting more hidden. There's no question about that. And there's no question that there's more sedation employed now than there probably ever has been. And that could masquerade as dying well. You know, you're sedated beyond belief, and the nursing notes at the front of the hallway say patient resting comfortably. I mean, that happens, but I'm not sure the patient is resting. And I'm not sure, I think the statement of being comfortable might be slightly overrated or under investigated. You see what I'm saying? So, you know, I'm unfortunately, I'm hard to placate on this business, and only because what I saw has, in a way, you could say, has charged me with an obligation, which is not to blink on what I saw. And I'm not asking anybody to have the same experience as me. Well, I'm not asking anybody to do anything, frankly. But it seems what happens is periodically, people like yourself imagine that there's some possible upside that could ensue from me appearing and testifying faithfully to what I saw. And the surprise is that they're not all victory stories, you know. In fact, most of them aren't. And my own humble suggestion is, if we do not begin with a prolonged consideration about how things got to be as they are, then any wish list you have for things improving will very likely be a product of how insane stuff has become, not a real alternative to it.
Yep, I hear you. I know one of the things that you said, that I heard you say in another interview, was about how when we start talking about what's wrong, because we are so disconnected from meaning and soul and, you know, a real life, I guess, with, you know, from that soul place, that we always want to jump to what do we do about things, and we don't take the time to understand what's really going on, what's really wrong, and get down into the roots of things. So we keep bumbling through shallow errors in living.
Yes, it's a good characterization. Well, you could say that there's an undiagnosed addiction in the popular culture of North America, and it's to fixes. Strangely enough, that you would think that looking for the next fix is inherently forward thinking and the rest, but actually, what I've seen is the addiction to looking for the next thing to roll off the assembly line from Switzerland or whatever it is. That comes from the way it is. That's an attribute of things as they stand. That is not an alternative to things as they stand. It's a complete unwillingness. Among other things, it's a kind of dereliction of duty, frankly. If you imagine that there are people in their teens and their 20s who are watching this happen, who are watching people in their 40s and 50s and 60s and so forth come to their dying in this fashion, what do you imagine the life lesson that these young people bring away from this kind of encounter? Do you think their orientation to dying is somehow deepened and their wisdom? You understand? There's no conceivable way they'll bring that story away from what they've seen. The lesson they'll bring with them is, for God's sake, don't die. Whatever the hell you do, don't make that mistake. And of course, now, depending on what province you live in, the jurisdictions will sooner or later all come around on the euthanasia question. There's no doubt. And within that young person's lifetime, you will be able not to die. And this will be legal, and this will be aided and abetted by the state through the healthcare system. And I'm not saying should or shouldn't. I'm acknowledging something else, that the advent of euthanasia is probably a death-phobic culture's solution to itself, that it itself writes the prescription for. And when I said earlier, euthanasia is for people who don't want to die, this is the way I would say it, because euthanasia is not dying. It's engineering the means by which you'll be killed. You see, it is fundamentally a different thing. That's all. You might vote for it anyway. Fine. I'm not disqualifying anything, but I think it behooves us to perhaps consider that these are different animals entirely. Your dying is not something you are, quote, in control of, unquote, nor, in my opinion, should it be. Euthanasia, on the other hand, is nothing but an exercise of control. You know what that's called? Same old song.
Yeah, and certainly control is an addiction in this society as well. Speaking from personal experience, the desire to control everything and not to be able to be present for what's here now and respond accordingly.
Yeah, that's all I can say. Yes, I understand.
Yeah, yeah. So rolling this into our condition as a culture and the trouble we're in, and looking at it also as the death of the old paradigm, the death of an old culture, and the birth of something new, for better or worse. How can we learn from this initiation of the great crossing of death and our fear of death? How can we relate that to what we're in as a culture, locally and globally?
Well, I'd be very surprised if you could bring any particular 20 people into a room and get a consensus about what the state of affairs is. Really and truly. I mean, when you have quote unquote leaders of the free world, forgive me for that awful characterization, but that's what they call themselves. And you have these people in a room, and for public and for private consideration, they simply sneer at the prospects that we have coaxed the ending of our vision of things to its very brink. I mean, you can get very little in the way of consensus about that, it seems to me now. And the best way to get elected in the free world, quote unquote, is to offer people an alternative before you've talked about what it's an alternative to. So I'm with W.H. Auden, frankly, who said, it seems to me that we would rather be defeated than be persuaded. That is a grim, but I think deeply authentic take on what a consumer culture asks of itself. And that's what we principally are. I can tell you this, I have been on the road off and on for about 12 or 14 years now. And this consumer culture aspect of things is so pervasive. It affects all manner of people who imagine themselves to be free of all that. And one of the ways it manifests itself is this idea that you can simply purchase your way towards sanity or lucidity. You can just choose it, you see. And I mean, so then how come it's not there if that's all there is to it? If it's that simple, why are we in the fix that we're in, unless you don't happen to think we're in any kind of fix at all? So I've just finished writing a book that, if all goes well, it'll come out in next summer. And it's about elderhood in a certain fashion. It is. One of the contentions I make in the book is, are you familiar with the term from I guess botany or biology, sentinel species? You familiar with this idea?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, the gist of it is, it's certainly not something you haven't thought of, but the phrase means something like this. There are certain species in the environment whose particular sensitivities to changes in light, let's say, or changes in sulfuric content of the water, whatever it might be, they live so close to this that these changes detonate in them in a way that no other species is affected, and early on too. So you could say then that you're familiar with the term canary in the coal mine. Well, it's
Yes.
basically the same idea. It's when the canary stops singing in the coal mine, that's when you're in trouble, because the canary's up by the top where the deadly vapors are, and it's killed the canary first. It's time to get out, kind of thing. So we have sentinel species in the environment, and I submit to you that the very young and the very old in the dominant culture of North America are now recognizably sentinel species for the serious problems that we're in. And it takes two forms. For the very young, it is the proliferation of what we now are becoming all too accustomed to, the designation or the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder and all of the alleged treatments for it and all the rest. Young people seem to be remarkably affected by this attention deficit disorder. Or as I'd like to say, you mean you have not been able to make a convincing case to them that they should be paying attention, which is at least as a legitimate way of characterizing it as the way it's talked about in the psychological trade. And in amongst the very old, what do you have? You have neurodegenerative disease of an extraordinary and striking commonality, whereby memory is one of the first and early casualties. And, people are gone long before they die. That person is long gone, staring out the window, not knowing there's a window and not knowing that there's a them.
Mm-hmm.
So you ask yourself, I'm certainly no expert, and I don't know if these things are occurring more frequently in the last 30, 40 years than they were prior. It's hard to know, and probably we'll never know, but why not take the chance of imagining that these things are beginning to proliferate amongst the young and amongst the old, and then begin to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about where things are? I mean, it is one thing to talk about environmental pollution, and it's an important and ongoing consideration, and it should be there. The kind of atmospheric dilemma I'm talking about, I suppose, is at the level of one's spirit, or the spirit of the culture, if we can even use the word culture anymore to characterize the kind of the lump of commonality that we've become, whereby we're most recognizable to each other by what's most familiar to us. And all the differences between us have become problems long ago to be solved by appealing to the lowest common denominator, or that secret self that's under the skin that, quote, everybody has, and that's where we're all one or equal or whatever it is. So you could, at this point, anybody's listening going, good God, am I supposed to listen to this and feel better? And I'll tell you what my answer is, no. No, if you want to feel better, you've got a million ways to do that already available to you. You don't need another one. They're out there. There's people selling you books, selling you seminars, selling you get help quick, get fixed fast, etc. on the street corner and so on. But how can you be purposefully, where can you find a kind of soul-driven sense of being troubled by the way things are that obliges the best part of you to rise to the surface and to answer the call of duty? I ask you, how does that happen? And this is what I'm on about. This is why I'm making the case that things are much worse than, from what I can tell, most people seem to think that they are.
Yeah, I agree, and I find what you have to say incredibly refreshing. Myself, I grew up in small town Saskatchewan, and in village, very close to my family, which was large and connected and included great aunties and uncles and the natural world. And I came to the city when I was a young woman, about 20, and began my indoctrination into the modern situation at fever pitch. And then when about 12 years ago, what I say is that I fell out the bottom of the world. I hit the end of meaning. I couldn't justify my career and the steps I was taking, and I kind of blew apart. I went crazy, as you say, and crazy for good reasons. And I hope to good results. I feel pretty grounded and centered in reality now. But for a while, I landed in a spiritual community that was hooked on positivity.
Oh, yeah.
Very immature, right? Spiritually immature.
Yeah.
And I actually felt more harmed by that than I did lifted. And I stepped away. I pushed away from the shore. And I went into some old ways of dealing with grief, because mine had been, I'd gotten to the point where, I worked in the man's world, and I was surrounded by men all the time. And the way that I move through trouble is to cry. And you don't get very far in a man's world when tears are leaking out your eyes. Yeah. And so I learned to turn it off.
Allow me to tell you that men don't get very far in a man's world either.
Yeah, I know, and I don't mean that to be unkind to men. I know that we're all in trouble.
I honestly don't think it's a useful phrase to use anymore. I'm not disputing that there are not issues of, where all the money goes and all of that. All I'm saying is, it's a deeply overplayed card now to imagine that this kind of gender specificity to privilege and to opportunity delivers on the promise. You see, that's all I'm saying. I mean, I know the casualties of the alleged beneficiaries of that arrangement, and I don't wish that upon anyone, frankly. So the idea of, people are hankering after inclusivity, but they want to be included in a madhouse. You see, it's not the kind of thing I would recommend as a solution. I would recommend dismantling the madhouse, not just getting more people into it.
Well, just to step back there, is like what I ended up suffering from was the suppression of grief, right? I was afraid to cry until I got to the point where I couldn't cry anymore. And it wasn't until I tapped that grief and let the floodgates go that I started to return, I guess, and catalyze the healing of what I now see as the beginnings of my initiation into eldership, or elderhood, as you call it.
Well, it's a fine story, and would that it continue. My own understanding of grief probably is a bit of a departure from the way you've characterized it, in that what I saw was in the death trade was the demonization, frankly, of grief, and the understanding that grief is something that comes at you from the outside. It's a kind of affliction. It means you're no good. Demeans and diminishes everywhere it appears, and it's an enemy of the positivistic, hope, cope, and dope regime that the dominant culture is so fond of. And I'm not sure that grief is, quote, the solution to any of that, but I'll say this, that there's something about grief that knows. It's something like getting it, not being comforted by getting it. That's for children. But for grown-ups, there is something about grief that has, I suppose, in some fashion, a willingness to know oneself, to be wrecked on schedule when it has occurred. And to, of course, wish for it to be otherwise, but to recognize at some deep and enduring level that this kind of wreckedness is not something that leaves you fundamentally capable as you once were. And although nobody signs up for that kind of dishevelment, what I've seen over the years is in a culture so chronically addicted to competence, grief is a welcome respite for being so desperately in charge all the friggin' time. And it gives you the opportunity to take a knee, so to speak, to cultivate something like a humility where there once was only humiliation as your only legitimate alternative to being, the one who's calling the shots. So grief is a kind of deep running intelligence that is not interested in your feelings. It's not interested in if you feel good about yourself, because grief is a consequence of your engagement with the world, it seems to me, not really a description of your inner state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it a great way to, as you say, to find some humility and to be stronger in a very rooted and grounded way, not in a grandiose way. To know who you are better and why you're here.
Well, a lot of people getting to know themselves better turns out not to be the birthday party they imagined it would be. I mean, I think these things are just important to point out. If you take a weekend seminar and getting closer to yourself, don't be surprised it's not what you counted on.
Mm-hmm.
Yourself is not Shangri-La. It's not the best idea that's ever come around. That's not a grim thing to say, but I mean, where are all these limitations in character and wisdom to be found if the self is not the clearinghouse for all that crazy stuff? So becoming more and more yourself, I mean, I'm not making up these phrases, of course, everybody's heard them, but becoming more and more yourself doesn't mean saner and wiser. We're talking about learning here. At least I am. I'm not talking about this kind of intuitive return to the self thing that you can fill up all the seminar rooms with that kind of promise. I have on occasion agreed to take a teaching gig at these I don't know what to call them, self-improvement meccas and the rest. And I simply look in the catalog at the names of the offerings that are there. And even to be associated with them, frankly, gives me the yips, because I simply can't believe that grown-ups would not only pay their money, but give whatever, some aspect of the time that they still have left to rescuing themselves from a normal life, which is where the best part of you is supposed to appear, in your normal life, not in your exceptional retreat life, in your normal life. You see, that's where the gold is to be found, and that's where the community or the village, that's where it appears, and that's how it gets fed. It doesn't seem to me it gets fed by grown-ups retreating.
I agree completely. Yeah, I agree, and I find probably similar things similarly cringeworthy. It's just another way, isn't it, of heaping everything on ourselves and being about us. It might be, for some of us, or at some point in our lives, we might be about fashion or status or title. And then once we have the breakdown, the soul breakdown, it then becomes the self-improvement phase, and actually doesn't really change much in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Well, again, as I said at the beginning, I wouldn't want to generalize and make observations about people's life choices, but I guess I've already done so. But all I can say is I'm looking around at the consequences of 60 or 80 years of psychotherapy and self-involvement and self-improvement and the rest. And it seems to me at this point, the benefits should be starting to roll in. I mean, if this were an investment strategy and 80 years into the investment, you had the return on investment that we have, you'd pull your money out. But the money's going into that. So there's another way of saying that old habits are fairly hard to break, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I'm not sure that what we're talking about now is going to drum up business for your event at this point.
Well, let's shift a little bit. And thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for maybe making up for something I may have left not in the best way. I want to talk a little bit before we part. I want to talk a little bit about this idea about orphan wisdom.
Okay.
It really, when I first heard of your school and orphan wisdom, I have to say I conjured up a little bit of a different idea about that than when I heard you say it in your own words. And when I heard you say it in your own words, it was far more meaningful than what the idea I had conjured up. And I also think that at a time like this, in a place like Canada, where we're in this truth and reconciliation process, and where we've got this history that we need to heal,
yes,
that this orphan wisdom you speak of is an important facet of how we might come through this.
I've never heard anybody make the connection in overt ways you just have done, and I feel very complimented that you've done so. Thank you for imagining that there could be some minor part to, for what I'm talking about to play in that situation that you've described. Well, I can tell you, first of all, that the phrase came to me simply as something that could stand in as a kind of shorthand, how should I put it, reckoning of what I imagined myself to be on about. Like everybody else, I kind of discovered what I was doing after I'd been doing it for a while. It was not that apparent to me that I was on about anything in particular. Never mind that it had a name and finally a website and all the other doodah that it's gathered over the years. And the reason I chose it is twofold. First of all, if I say the word orphan to you, chances are, and I ask you, how do we come by orphans? The typical response is, well, they have no parents. Well, of course, there's no such thing as you have no parents. The very facts of your face are a sign that you certainly did have parents. So you don't have an out clause there. Of course, what we're saying, there is such a thing as orphanhood, but it's not never having had parents. It's from where you are and from how you are, you cannot have a kind of direct access to your parents from here, from this. Okay, so I've always been talking about something like the dominant culture of North America. I make no claim that anything I'm talking about is relevant to any other people, of any other continent, or any other race, or anything of the kind. There are some people who decide otherwise, but I'm not encouraging that. I know something about where I should say lucky enough to have been born. And I do consider myself, as a Canadian, enormously fortunate. And I think that fortune confers upon me something like a responsibility, that I'm not just on the take where my good fortune is concerned. And this enterprise of mine is one attempt by me to deliver on the kind of obligation that seems to come with the territory of being lucky enough to have grown in a country such as this. So orphan then does not mean you don't come from anywhere. I'm talking about, let's get down to it here. I'm some people would refer to me easily and glibly as a white man or another white man. And well, I understand the designation. I'm not pretending that it's not out there, but I simply raise the question, if there's such a thing as white people, I wonder where the white homeland is that we all come from originally. And what's the white language, I wonder? And what's the white religion? And what's the white moral order, and so on? You start to wonder about it. It breaks down pretty quickly. So I've used the phrase, talking with you, the dominant culture of North America. That's composed of an awful lot of quote unquote white folks. That's true. But if I look around us, I'm still on the orphan part here. if I look around this hurt part of the world that I'm lucky enough to know something about, and I wonder where the hurt comes from, it seems to me a lot of the flailing around is recognizable as a kind of attribute or even a symptom of a deep sense of not being at home, of not knowing how to belong fundamentally, that we literally and in every other way foul our own nest, that I remember a gorgeous songwriter originally from Montreal who died last fall, whose name I won't say because he's so recently dead, but you know who I'm talking about, an international star and one of our finest products in this country. And he said, any legitimate culture recognizes the legitimacy of other cultures. That's one of its hallmarks. A real culture recognizes the reality of other cultures. And then you ask yourself, this dominant culture of North America, what other cultures does it recognize as being legitimate? Not envy, recognize. Not plunder, honor. And I don't see that happen. So it seems to me that you either chalk this up to, well, that's the way white people are, or you begin to come much closer to the deeply unwelcome possibility that all of that migration 200 or 300 years ago or more, that was allegedly about the likes of anybody who looks like me and perhaps like you, trying to better their lot and further their deal and all of that kind of thing. And the unfortunate and, say inconvenient discovery that there were people here, but they weren't really people and they weren't really here and they didn't need the whole place anyway. And, the whole sordid history that I'm referring to, all of that might not be a sign of mastery and, remarkable moral intelligence. That might be a sign of a kind of degree of lostness and frantic flight from what they no longer could bear, known as Europe. That might be the founding story of the kind of the unauthorized history of North America. This is why I've used the word orphan to characterize what I'm trying to, frankly, take on. Now to come to the second word. That sounds like a very grim characterization if I stop there, and it is. And there's grimness in it, that's certainly true. But it strikes me that the legitimate other half of the story is this, that there is not an extinction of wisdom that's a consequence of that kind of migration, that kind of spontaneous flight from the motherland or the homeland or what have you. But the enormous responsibility of the current generations, it seems to me, is to learn this wisdom. I don't know why it is that prejudices can be passed down with the breast milk, but wisdom seems to escape every generation that does not pursue it. I don't pretend I have an explanation for that, but it does strike me as true that prejudices can be inherited, but wisdom seems to have to be learned. So if you put the two things back together, orphan wisdom is an enterprise that imagines that there is a wisdom that now must be learned that has to come from the troubles that we're in, that can't be magically, flown in from the Amazon or from Tibet. God bless them all for the wisdoms that they've managed for themselves. But it seems to me that we've plundered plenty, and I would say long enough. And it would be time now to learn our poverties rather than plundering someone else's wisdom tradition.
Yep, I agree. And we didn't, I'm Scottish, Norwegian, Swedish in the lines, but 2 and 3 generations removed, and we don't have much. By the time I came along, we didn't have much left of tradition, of depth, cultural depth, ritual, other than what Christianity had brought.
Well, probably, your folks agreed to quote unquote be from here after a while. They had a hyphenated identity for a little while, as many recent immigrants tend to have. And the grandchildren of the people who came over who are they to themselves? And who are these strange grandparents to them? They bear no resemblance to the people they go to school with. They have strange food, strange smells, strange accent. And the grandchildren seem to have no hankering after that from which the grandparents come. So it is, in some respects, it's an old story. And it is certainly the recent wound of the dominant culture of North America, just as you described it. But it's not the same thing as saying there's nothing. And this is what I'm, making the deep plea on behalf of, that for us to agree that we come from nothing is basically to make the case for the white supremacy thing that is now rising yet again on this friggin' continent. That they're making a case for this noble ancestry, and drawing the kids in significant numbers. I mean, it concerns me at least. And white supremacy is a sign of a poverty that's unwilling to learn itself. And so it invents a noble history that it doesn't want to know the real history. It wants to have a history and not learn one. You see, I'm not saying it's not understandable. I'm saying it's another symptom. It's not a solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you're here to help shed a light on matters like this and to speak so effectively and meaningfully about it, Stephen. It matters, so thank you a lot.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you too for saying so.
Now, Orphan Wisdom School, you have enrollments a few times a year, I think I saw, and
No, I open them up when I think I have the energy to make another 2-year commitment to another 100 or so people. And I just recently did that, I guess, in spring. And so I have three new classes and then a kind of graduate class at this point. But one of the classes is in Europe, if you can believe it. So Europeans are coming to that version of the school. We're having it in Iceland in the spring. And I had it in Wales last spring. And, it's really at this point in my energy and my everything else I have going that I make the commitment when I think I can follow through. So I don't have a revolving open door policy. The next year I have another 100 and that kind of thing. But I'm lucky enough that I have people who return and seem to, they encourage me in some fashion to proceed. So I have the school and then a number of teaching tours that one of which is bringing me to Saskatoon. I think it's next month. Is that correct? In November?
Yeah, November 13th.
Right. And I mean, these are also a fortune of a different kind. I get out on the road. I'm in the middle of other people's lives. I'm not here at my farm. And I'm reminded again and sometimes deeply instructed about the kind of new normal that has ensued since the last time I looked. And you could say I do my research, in the hotel rooms, watching the television because I don't have one here, and being on the road and meeting people and seeing what's concerning them, and see if I can be of some kind of use. It's really all that it is. There's no guru stuff involved here. It's trying to be useful in a troubled time. And I'm lucky enough that at this age, I'm 63 now, that the invitations mysteriously continue. I'm not encouraging them, but I'm complimented when they come. And I haven't been in Saskatoon for years. It was a city when I was in my early 30s, I thought I could live here. I really liked it at the time. It didn't work out, but I still have a fondness for that flatness of Saskatchewan, which I don't think is a nothing, as it's so cruelly depicted. I think it's a kind of remarkable depth that line on the horizon is, and hard to distinguish clouds from the water and so on. That's a place I've always loved, and I'm looking forward to coming back.
Well, and we are looking forward to welcoming you. I'm proud to be here. It isn't all flat.
Of course.
Yeah.
Down south by Weyburn, I'm talking about.
Yeah, I myself was born at near Little Manitou Lake, which is a sacred land and salt water, healing waters. And I lived in the Ottawa Valley.
Yeah.
So I kind of smile when people say Saskatchewan's flat, because because my upbringing really wasn't like that. But I do understand the characterization.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all right. So thank you very much, Stephen. Is there anything you'd like to say before we close?
Good luck to us all.
Yeah, really. So Stephen Jenkinson, November 13th in Saskatoon. To get tickets, you can go to picketic.com and search Die Wise, or you can go to chisaskatoon.ca. That's CHISASKATOON.ca, and find a link to buy direct from us there. Thank you very much, Stephen. I look forward to seeing you next month.
We'll see you then. Thank you.
All righty.